This is Dr. Mike, and welcome to Chapter 3 of our ethics course. I wanted to share a few things with you by way of thinking. Some areas of this book will be rather dense, difficult to absorb. I may have mentioned to you earlier that when I was 18 and just starting college, that I found philosophy and things like ethics to be really difficult because I didn't have life experience to go along with it. I think you will find as you move forward that you will appreciate the things that we talk about as you get older because they are much more understandable, applicable to our thinking and our way of doing and being. So hopefully that will be the case. Some things you will kind of put on the shelf and pull down later to think about when you are out in the business world and dealing with people and understanding how people's minds operate, how they think, how they work, and how you have to relate to them. And that's where ethics really comes into the fore in our understanding is how do we relate to other people. One of the great needs of the day, I think, is to develop what we talked about a little bit last time about global ethical perspective. It can be quite challenging because ethical values and principles can vary greatly across different cultures. And even if you never leave the United States, we realize that we live in a multicultural society. And so it behooves us to think about how other people think, how they act, react, so that we can accommodate them as much as we can. We can understand them. And when we fail to dialogue and understand them, we're going to have lots of problems in areas like fairness and justice and respect for human dignity. One of the battles that I had, and I think I've mentioned to you that I was a pastor for 20 years. Most times in religion, our objective is to try to recruit other people to our religion. And I struggle with that sometimes because I feel like that when we set ourselves up as having the only answer, the only belief system, the only thing that will work, then we exclude lots of other people. And that's the thing about Christianity. Christianity is an exclusive religion, that we're the only ones going to heaven. We're the only ones doing correctly. So that makes everybody else wrong. And the British used to have this idea that it was their job their burden to share, to civilize the world. Because most standards of civilization that we hold to, we believe them to be like Christian values. And so we did that with the American Indians, for instance. When Columbus looked at them through European eyes and Christian eyes, he saw people that were naked. He said they didn't wear European clothes. They had some clothes. He saw they had no religion because he didn't see a Bible, didn't see a cross. And so to him, they were savages, they were barbarians, they were not Christian, not civilized. So it's really difficult for us to understand the diverse cultural context in which ethical values are formed, and that's different for every culture. And it's also challenging to reconcile conflicting ethical principles and values. If we have differences, then it's very difficult for us within communities to understand that. For instance, if we have Muslim people in our community, it's very difficult for us to understand that they are very different in their religious practice. This week happens to be Ramadan, when they fast and pray 5 times a day. And it's very different from our usual lens that we look at the world through. But we do have to understand that there are certain guidelines that are different than our own. And then, of course, we talked last time about the various power imbalances that exist in our world. And some of those are religious, some of them are political, some of them are economic, all those different things come into play. Today, chapter 3 talks about ethical relativism. That helps us to grow to understand more clearly the ideas we're trying to convey in this class. We have a lot of terms. Relativism can be based upon what we call epistemological claims about what we know. Relativism can also be based on a claim that the nature of values, like we discussed in chapter 1, that there are different nature of values, that values have different things to teach us. Descriptive relativism refers to the belief that different cultures and different societies have different moral codes and they have different beliefs, that these codes should be studied and understood on their own terms. We should not study them in a judgmental way, but we should study them to understand. It really does help you to take cultural classes. It helps you to take other religion classes. One of the best classes I think I ever had was on Buddhism, to understand the Buddhist principles of life. Really not only helped me to understand lots of other people, but it also helped me to reflect upon my own beliefs and things of that caliber. So these codes ought to be studied and understood on their own terms. There's a meta-ethical relativism. On the one hand, that is a view that moral truths and moral values are relative to individual beliefs, cultures, and traditions or social norms. In other words, a meta-ethical relativism denies the existence of objective moral facts that are true independently of what anyone believes. So there is nothing else except, that one particular group. You don't have to. You're not comparing your ethics or your thoughts with other groups. The term objectivism, you'll see in this chapter, is criticized for assuming that moral truths exist independently of human beliefs and that they can be discovered through reason. That by reason we can come up with ethical beliefs that are totally comparative to everyone, not just the particular group that you're dealing with. That's what objectivism says. Subjectivism is criticized for reducing moral claims to mere expressions of preferences or emotions. It's much more than just my preference or your preference as to what our morals are. That's one of the reasons why we work on early in the class your ethical statement. I'm telling you that statement may change as you go through life, as you gain experience, as you learn things. But when you look at that, compare that with other people in your cohort, you realize that even in such a small group that there are differences in ethical beliefs. We were raised differently. We were taught differently. We have different religions. We have different characters in our mother and fathers that make us turn out. So a lot of it is environmental, things you learn in the home, things you learn growing up in your church, in your religious body, whatever that might be, makes for a very different way to look at morals and look at it. So that's is there a overarching system of morals for everybody in the world? Probably not entirely. But relativism is often criticized for failing to provide any objective basis for moral judgments. And moral realism is criticized for being unable to explain how we can know objective moral truths. How do you know that? Can a child be raised to be immoral, to have no moral values? I think we probably see that more in our society today than we ever in the past, mainly because our children in this generation are so disconnected from the family, so disconnected from the mothering and the fathering by technology. I think technology does have quite a different take on what we do, how we raise our children. Most children, we used to criticize in the 60s, that children were being raised by the television. But at least the things they learned on TV, while there might have been some things that were not good, were taught them by other human characters. So, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Captain Kangaroo, lots of children's programs always had some kind of moral teaching about not stealing or lying. Sesame Street would have been a big one. Maybe some of you watched Sesame Street. Those were programs designed to teach moral aptitudes to children. We don't have those anymore. Those have gone away. Cartoons, actually. When I grew up, we watched cartoons, and cartoons always had, some moral. The good guy always wins, and all those things that we learned. Those were entered into our environment, and we learned those. And of course, it made school and other things were all about that. We memorized Bible verses in school. We were taught to play together, all kind of moral things. Kids today don't go out and play anymore. Play in psychology. When I was doing psychology in the 80s, the advent of play for children was considered to be an interesting thing. If children did not play, they didn't learn to relate to other people and have all these problems. We have those problems today because we have young people that never leave their bedroom. They stay on video games. I know parents that deliver their meals to the door and they take it through the door, eat their meal, keep their game going. They never come out and communicate. They never come out and talk to each other. A few years ago, I had a dad in his 40s came to class one morning. He was absolutely mad at his teenager because she had texted him from her bedroom down to the living room rather than come down and talk to him directly. And I told him, I said, that's not the worst thing I've heard. I know married couples that sit in their living room and text each other while they watch TV rather than talk to each other. So a lot of things like relativism have to do with the world that we live in. And relativism poses a problem for moral judgments because it denies the existence of objective moral truths that can serve as a basis. How do we pass judgment on another person when they have different values than we do? If they have the same values, it's helpful. That's why in a society, in the beginning, when they started to live together, they passed things like the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were the unifying force of the Hebrew nation. They came together around those, or the laws of Hammurabi, or the laws of 12 tables with the Romans. They all had similar values. And you'll notice, especially in Rome, when those values begin to erode, when they begin to bring barbarians into the army who didn't know Rome, that their society began to crumble and go away. We see a little bit of that today because in a multi-ethnic society like we have, with all the values we have, we're losing the things that do connect us, like removing the Ten Commandments from the average courtroom or courthouse in America because that was our basis for foundation. Those things become troubling because our society kind of goes to pot, and you can see that very well by just looking around you. So relativism, there's a problem with that there. Without any objective basis for moral judgment, it's difficult to say whether one moral code is better than another or to criticize the practice that would seem to violate basic moral principles. We're seeing that presently with the war in Ukraine, in which this week Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, was brought up on charges by the World Court for kidnapping children from Ukraine, taking them back to Russia, which would be considered a war crime. But the problem is Russia does not recognize the World Court. And so how do you enforce that? It's just a statement that is made. So relativism is interesting in that sense. Pluralism is that idea that we bring all things under the same heading, that we only have one set of morals, that is true for everyone, and that's extremely difficult to come by. But pluralism is the recognition that there are multiple ways of understanding the world and that different cultures and societies may have different moral codes and values that are equally good. And I think that's where if we reach that place, that we would probably get along better in the world. But relativism takes the recognition further by denying the existence of objective moral truths and by arguing that moral judgments are relative to individual beliefs and cultural norms. So there are no absolutes, basically. That whatever is moral for you is correct, whatever is moral for me is correct, and they don't have to agree. You don't have to dot every I and jot every T. But we have the freedom. But there has to be somewhere in that an absolute stopping point. We've seen in this country our judicial system erode based on this new relativism, where there are no absolutes, and that's a part of the upset in our society today, trying to get back to the old way to where there was some foundation upon which to build. And so relativism is a major problem. I know that from religion, where I spent 20 years, that there's a lot of upheaval now in the acceptance of new ideas that we didn't accept before. So arguments in favor of relativism include the recognition of cultural diversity and the rejection of ethnocentrism or cultural imperialism, that there is one race, that white is superior over all the races, and that people of color should be subjected to that. That was the idea of the 1800s under slavery in one sense. But that's not true. There's not one superior race on the planet. That's what Adolf Hitler attempted to do in World War II, was to perform or build a master race. Relativism is often associated with a commitment to tolerance because it recognizes that different cultures and individuals may have different moral beliefs and practices, and that we should respect those differences. Respect is one of the things that the battle in American public is going on today. How do you respect people you don't agree with? And that is, we don't tend to have that kind of tolerance in our society. Religion will make us intolerant at times. We don't accept gay people. We don't accept gay marriage. We don't accept biracial couples. There were not many years ago when there were laws that one got struck down in Virginia by the Supreme Court, in which it was illegal for a black and white to marry. They did not apply that to any other person of color, just black and white, because that came from a cultural dominance and imperialism in the 1800s, in which the white was dominant over black, and that was even preached from the pulpits. Some of the most atrocious things you can think about were preached by well-meaning people from the pulpit, that maybe black people evolved according to Darwin's theory and white people didn't, and it gave them a reason to abuse and use people in ways that we know very well from our history. There's been a lot of tolerance, and I feel like from the 60s up until maybe 5 years ago, we had made some progress in tolerance. We elected an African-American man for president, but you listen to the rhetoric outside of that and you realize a lot of that old racism. They weren't against Barack Obama being his programs. They were just against him being black and being president. And I mean, they made some frightful statements about Mrs. Obama and him. So relativism might come up in conversation about concrete moral issues when individuals and cultures have different moral beliefs or practices that seem to conflict with each other. In such cases, it's important to understand the basis of these beliefs, to recognize the possibility that there are cultural differences or historical contingencies that may account for them. It's also important to engage in critical reflection to consider whether certain moral claims are defensible or whether they are justifiable. So you have to think through. The ethics calls you to think through, to think about, to meditate on the fact that there is plurality, that there is more than one way to do things, that there's more than one mindset. And that's particularly true of us who are Westerners, because we usually take the mindset that ours is the only way to do something. When there are perfectly good cultures, other places like China or Japan or India, that think very differently because they come from a different worldview than we do. And so, it's really interesting when you look at that from the standpoint of Christianity, which has a lateral view of history, that we have a past, present, future. We're going somewhere. Most Asian religions have a circular view where you recombine, they believe in reincarnation. You're constantly coming back as a different organism, trying to reach a certain level where you join the energy of the universe. So it's a very different worldview there. You're not looking at a future. They don't talk in terms of heaven or what happens in the afterlife after you die. It's about recombining, reassessing, coming back, and having good karma. So these things I think you'll find very interesting as you read this chapter, and I'd be interested to entertain any questions that you might have. Thanks for listening, and we will see you tomorrow.